October 14th, 1944. A pine forest near Aachen, Germany. The rain has been falling for 11 straight hours. If you were a German officer named Hauptmann Ernst Bauer, 36 years old, 3 combat tours behind you, Iron Cross First Class on your tunic, you had just watched something that your entire professional life had taught you was impossible. Across a clearing, not 200 meters away, a single American sergeant had taken his squad and split it into 3 teams without waiting for orders from anyone. His lieutenant was dead. His captain was somewhere behind the line. The radio was wet and half broken, and that sergeant had, without hesitation, pulled out his map, pointed at 3 positions, and put each of his teams on a separate axis of advance. Within 90 seconds, one of those teams had pinned Bauer's machine gun nest. Within 3 minutes, a second team had flanked it. Within 6 minutes, Bauer was dead, and his position was in American hands. Bauer's commanding officer, who survived the day and was interrogated in a prison camp 3 weeks later, told his American interviewer one sentence that would appear, slightly rewritten, in U.S. Army after-action reports for the next 30 years. "Your sergeants," he said, "make decisions that my colonels would not make." He said it almost in admiration. He said it almost in anger. He said it mostly in confusion, because in the Wehrmacht he had served for 12 years. A sergeant who did what that American sergeant did would have been court-martialed by sundown, if he had survived. That's the story you're about to hear. Not a story about generals or grand strategy. A story about a single strip of cloth on a man's sleeve, 3 stripes, and why those 3 stripes in the U.S. Army carried more real authority than 3 stars did in most armies on the planet. This is the war you never hear about, not the war of tank battles and headline maps, the war of small decisions made fast at the lowest possible level by men whose names nobody remembers. And it's the war, more than any other, that the Germans could not win, because they could not understand it, and because in the end they could not copy it, even when they saw it working, even when their own men were dying to it every single day. Part 1. 3 stripes and the man who wore them. Let's start with a specific man. His name was Anthony Valente. He was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1921, the 3rd son of an Italian stonecutter who had come through Ellis Island in 1909. Anthony finished high school in 1939. He worked at a machine shop for 2 years. He was drafted in January 1942. 21 years old. He didn't want to be a soldier. He wanted to open a garage with his older brother Sal, but he went when the letter came. He trained at Camp Wheeler in Georgia. By the end of basic, his drill sergeant had pulled him aside and told him he was going to be sent to non-commissioned officer school. Anthony asked what that meant. The sergeant said, "It means you're going to learn how to be the man who tells other men what to do when nobody with a bar on his shoulder is still alive to tell them." Anthony said he didn't want that job. The sergeant said, "Nobody wants that job, son. That's why you're getting it." 2 years later, October 1944, Anthony Valente was Staff Sergeant Anthony Valente, 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, somewhere in a pine forest in western Germany, with rain running off his helmet and 3 dead men in the ditch behind him, 2 of them his. His lieutenant had been killed at 0640 by a sniper. His radio had been soaked through when a mortar shell landed in a puddle next to it at 0712. His company commander was 200 meters back at battalion headquarters, unreachable. Anthony had 12 men left in his squad. He had a map. He had a compass. He had 1 functioning M1919 machine gun and about 200 rounds of belt ammunition. And he had a problem. The problem was a German MG-42 nest that was pinning down the entire platoon to his left and had already killed 6 men in the last 40 minutes. Anthony Valente did not call battalion. He did not request permission. He did not wait for someone with a commission to tell him what to do. He called his 3 team leaders over, Corporal Brown, Corporal Fitch, and PFC Molinaro. He pointed at the map, and he said, "Brown, you go left through those pines. Fitch, you stay here and keep that 1919 firing at them. Molinaro, you come with me on the right. We'll hit them from 3 sides. Go on, go." And they went. And 90 seconds later, the flanking team was in position. And 3 minutes after that, the MG-42 was silenced. And 6 minutes after that, Anthony's squad had taken the position, captured 2 wounded Germans, and sent a runner to battalion reporting the position secured. Anthony Valente was 23 years old. He had 3 stripes on his sleeve. He had no authority, on paper, to order any of what he had just done. He had done it anyway. And he had done it because every American sergeant in Europe in 1944 had been trained, not once, but 1,000 times, to do exactly that when the moment came. That was the doctrine. That was the culture. That was the thing the Germans never understood, and the thing that killed Hauptmann Ernst Bauer and the 6 men in the nest with him, and thousands upon thousands of men like them, across the entire Western Front for the last 11 months of the war. Now pause for a minute and ask yourself something, because this next question is the whole story. Why could Anthony Valente do this? And why could no German sergeant do the same thing against him? Part 2. The Prussian Way. To understand why the Germans were stumped, you have to understand where they came from. And you have to understand it with respect, because what they were doing was not stupid. It was not backward. It was the product of 200 years of some of the most rigorous military thinking in the history of the world. The German army, starting with the Prussian General Staff in the 1840s, had built its command culture around one principle: precision. Every order had to come from the correct officer. Every officer had to have the correct training. Every man in the chain had to execute what he was told, exactly to the letter, without improvisation. This had worked. It had worked in 1866 against the Austrians. It had worked in 1870 against the French. It had nearly worked in 1914. And it had worked spectacularly in 1939 and 1940. German doctrine did have a concept called Auftragstaktik, mission command. On paper, it said that a junior officer should be told the commander's intent, not every detail, and should use initiative to accomplish that intent. On paper. In practice, by 1944, Auftragstaktik had largely died. It had died under the pressure of ideology. It had died under the purges of officers who disagreed with Hitler. It had died because Hitler himself distrusted initiative and punished failed improvisation with execution. And it had died, most of all, because German military culture had never extended initiative below the officer level. An officer could, in theory, improvise. A sergeant in the Wehrmacht could not. Let me say that again, because this is the hinge on which the entire Western Front swung. A sergeant in the Wehrmacht, a man named Feldwebel or Unteroffizier, did not have the authority to redirect his men without an order. He did not have the authority to choose his flanking axis. He did not have the authority to request artillery. He did not have the authority, in most cases, to even decide whether to press an attack or pull back without a lieutenant present to say yes. His job was to make sure that whatever the lieutenant had said happened. He was a supervisor, not a decision-maker. The decisions happened above him. This was not laziness on the German side. This was doctrine, and it had a logic. The logic was that German officers were, on average, extremely well-trained, highly educated men, often with years at a Kriegsakademie behind them. Their enlisted men, by 1944, were often teenagers with 6 weeks of training and a rifle they had barely fired. Putting decisions in the officer's hands made sense, because the officer was the one who could make them correctly. There was also a cultural dimension that went deeper than military doctrine. German society in 1944 was still, at its core, hierarchical. A workman did not question his foreman. A clerk did not question his manager. A son did not question his father. A sergeant did not question his officer. And a sergeant certainly did not take over the officer's job, even if the officer was dead. That was not his place. To act above his station, even in an emergency, would have felt wrong, socially wrong, before it felt wrong militarily. Centuries of Prussian discipline had built this into the bones of the German soldier. It was not something he could override with a moment's decision. It was who he was. The problem, by October of 1944, was twofold. First, most of the good German officers were dead. They had been dying at catastrophic rates since 1941. The replacement pipeline for lieutenants and captains had become, by mid-1944, a kind of meat grinder in reverse, feeding young men into commissioned positions far faster than any proper training system could absorb. Some German lieutenants at Aachen had been in training as late as June of 1944. 4 months later, they were leading platoons against the U.S. First Army. Many of them had never commanded men under fire before. Many of them were dead within their first week in the line. Second, the surviving officers were often far from their men. Radio equipment was poor. Wire communications were cut by artillery. A German company commander might be unable to reach 2 of his 3 platoons for hours at a time. And when his officers went down, as they did constantly, the men below them stopped moving. They stopped making decisions, because nobody had told them they were allowed to. That's what Hauptmann Bauer's colleague meant when he told the American interrogator that his colonels would not make the decisions American sergeants made. He was not exaggerating. He was describing the institutional reality of his service. In the Wehrmacht, authority flowed downward in a narrow pipe, and when the pipe was broken, the water stopped. In the U.S. Army, authority was distributed widely, and deliberately, across thousands of men who wore chevrons on their sleeves rather than bars on their shoulders. And when parts of the pipe got broken, the water kept flowing, because there were 100 other paths. There is one more wrinkle that the German Army made for itself, and it deserves mention because it made everything worse. Since 1938, and especially after the July 20th, 1944 plot against Hitler, the Wehrmacht had been progressively purged of officers who showed too much independent thinking. Officers who questioned orders were watched. Officers who improvised in ways that were later shown to be correct, but contradicted directives from above were not always rewarded. Sometimes they were disciplined. In some cases, they were executed. This had a chilling effect on the remaining officer corps, but it had an even worse effect on the sergeants below them. If a German officer was afraid to improvise because improvisation could cost him his career or his life, then a German sergeant had absolutely no incentive at any level to improvise. He had every incentive to stand still and wait for orders. Waiting for orders was safe. Acting without them was how you ended up in front of a tribunal. The Wehrmacht of late 1944 was not the Wehrmacht of 1940. The officers who had fought in France had been more willing to take initiative. They had largely been killed or relieved. Their replacements had learned over 4 years that the safest path in the German army was to do exactly what the written order told you to do, and nothing more. Part 3. How the Americans got there. The U.S. Army that landed at Omaha Beach and fought through the hedgerows and into Germany was not an ancient army. It was not a force built over 200 years of Prussian theory. It was an army that in 1939 had been 29th in the world in size, smaller than the Army of Portugal. It had learned everything it knew about modern war in the 3 years between Pearl Harbor and D-Day. And one of the things it had learned the hard way in North Africa in 1943 was that its original command culture was wrong. At Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, the Americans had been humiliated. Rommel's Africa Corps had punched through green American units and scattered them across the Tunisian desert. American officers, trained in the classical way, had waited for orders from above. When the orders did not come, because the units above them were also being overrun, the men in the field had frozen. They had suffered catastrophic casualties. And the commanders who survived, men like Omar Bradley, Lucian Truscott, George Patton, had come away from Kasserine with a specific conclusion. The American soldier, they wrote in their reports, was a capable and aggressive fighter when he knew what to do. But he needed to be able to make decisions at every level of the unit. If a platoon leader was killed, the platoon sergeant had to take over immediately, without confusion, without waiting for permission. If the platoon sergeant was killed, the squad leader had to take over. And if every NCO in the squad was down, the ranking private had to take command. This had to be drilled into every man, and it had to be trained until it was muscle memory. The man who did the most to turn this conclusion into doctrine was a brigadier general named Charles Bolte and his colleagues at the Army Ground Forces headquarters at Fort Benning, Georgia. Between the spring of 1943 and the end of that year, they revised every piece of infantry training in the United States Army. Infantry school was rebuilt. NCO school was rebuilt. Every enlisted man in basic training was taught that if his leader went down, the next man took command immediately, without delay, without consultation. This was drilled in classroom sessions. It was drilled in field exercises. It was drilled in live fire courses. It was drilled in a training environment designed to be deliberately confusing and ambiguous, so that men would learn to make decisions without perfect information. The Fort Benning exercises had a specific name. They called them leader kill drills. The scenario was simple. A platoon would be running a live attack on a simulated position. At some random moment, the lieutenant in charge would receive a tap on the shoulder from an umpire. "You're dead. Get down." The lieutenant would drop, and the platoon sergeant had about 4 seconds to take over, redirect fire, and continue the attack. If he hesitated, the umpire would kill him too. "You're dead. Get down." Now the squad leader had the platoon. 4 more seconds. If he hesitated, the umpire would walk down the line, killing men, until somebody took charge. Sometimes they went all the way down to a PFC before anybody moved. That PFC would finish the exercise commanding what was left of a platoon. The next day, they would run the drill again, and again, and again. By the 6th week, every man in the platoon knew, in his bones, that the moment of leadership could fall on him with no warning, and that if it did, he was expected to do something. Not wait, not ask, do. By the spring of 1944, a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army could take over a platoon if both the lieutenant and the senior sergeant went down. A sergeant could take over a squad. A corporal could take over a team. A PFC could take over, if it came to it, a fire team of his friends. And every man in that chain had been practicing the skill of taking over, for months, sometimes for years. One specific number matters here. Between January 1943 and June 1944, the U.S. Army graduated approximately 67,000 new non-commissioned officers from NCO schools. 67,000 sergeants, Every one of them taught directly that his job was to make decisions and not wait. For comparison, the Wehrmacht produced about 18,000 new Unteroffiziere in the same period, and their training emphasized supervision and discipline, not independent decision-making. The scale was different, the content was different, and the outcome, by the summer of 1944, would be different too. The Germans never developed this. The Soviets never developed this. The Japanese certainly never developed this. Their entire military culture was built on obedience to a superior who was presumed to always be present. The British developed a partial version, but their class system limited how far down the authority could flow without awkwardness. The Americans, alone among the great combatant armies of 1944, pushed real command authority all the way down to the man with 3 stripes on his sleeve. And then they trained him, hard, for over a year before they sent him to France. This is the quiet thing. This is the thing that doesn't make the newsreels. This is the thing that no German officer ever saw coming, because nothing in his experience, nothing in his training, nothing in his doctrine prepared him to expect that an enlisted American, a man the Wehrmacht officer corps considered barely a soldier, could do what Anthony Valente did in a pine forest outside Aachen on a rainy morning in October of 1944. If this video is reaching you and giving you something real about your father or your grandfather or your uncle who served in any of those infantry units, hit the like button. These men are mostly gone now. Every time one of these stories is watched, the men who did the work are remembered for a few more minutes. It costs nothing. It matters more than it should. Now let me show you what happened when the doctrine that was trained into Anthony Valente met the doctrine that had trained Hauptmann Bauer. Part 4. The Collision. Hurtgen Forest, November 1944. The worst single battle the American infantry fought in the entire European war. 50 square miles of dense pine forest, steep ravines, and German bunkers built into the terrain over 3 years. The 28th Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, the 9th, the 8th, eventually 9 American divisions rotated through that forest in 3 months of fighting. 24,000 American casualties. 9,000 of them killed. A Verdun for the American Army, and almost nobody outside the units who were there has ever really heard of it. The forest itself was a nightmare. The canopy was so thick that artillery shells burst in the treetops and rained down wooden splinters on the men below. A wounded soldier who might have survived in open country often bled to death in the Hurtgen because no medic could find him and no stretcher could be carried through the brush. Maps were useless. 2 squads moving parallel at 50 meters distance could not see or hear each other. Radios failed. Wires were cut by every shell. Officers died at 4 times the rate of their men. That last number is important. 4 times the rate. That meant that within the first week of any American regiment's deployment to the Hurtgen, something like half of its lieutenants and captains were dead or wounded. And what took over, in unit after unit, was the non-commissioned officer corps. Inside that forest, the thing that kept the American advance going, when almost everything else had failed, was what the German defenders would describe in their after-action reports with the same word, over and over. Unteroffizierkrieg. Sergeant's War. Let me describe what they meant. The terrain in the Hurtgen was so dense that radio signals could not penetrate it reliably. Officers could lose contact with their own men 40 meters away. Platoons were routinely separated from companies. Companies were routinely separated from battalions. Orders, when they came hours late, and often from men who had no idea what was actually happening on the ground. For the Wehrmacht defenders, this meant paralysis. A German lieutenant who lost contact with his captain would, in many cases, just hold his position, not knowing whether to counterattack, withdraw, or dig in. A German sergeant in that same situation was waiting for the lieutenant to tell him. Neither man was a coward. Neither man was a fool. They were both operating inside a doctrine that did not give them permission to act without orders, and the orders were not coming. For the Americans, the same conditions produced the opposite effect. A staff sergeant who lost contact with his lieutenant looked at the terrain, looked at his men, made a decision, and attacked. A platoon sergeant who lost contact with his captain pulled in the 2 squads he still had and attacked. A corporal who lost contact with his platoon sergeant took the 4 men around him and attacked. The attacks were not always correct. They were not always successful. Many of them were disasters. But the relentless forward pressure from dozens of independent small units, all making their own decisions in the absence of higher command, ground the German defense down. The Germans, meanwhile, were waiting for permission to counterattack. And while they waited, the Americans were taking another 100 meters of forest. Let me give you one specific moment. November 8th, 1944. A rifle platoon of the 112th Infantry Regiment, 28th Division, pinned down by German mortar and machine gun fire near a logging road called the Call Trail. The platoon leader, a second lieutenant, had been killed the previous night. The platoon sergeant, a staff sergeant named Francis Tomaszewski, 27 years old, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, took command. He had 19 men left. He could not reach company headquarters. He could see German movement to his front, left, and right. Tomaszewski did 3 things in the space of maybe 4 minutes. First, he sent 2 of his best riflemen to the left with 1 rifle grenade each, and told them to make noise like a full squad. Second, he took the rest of his men to the right, under the cover of the noise, and found a draw that ran behind the German position. Third, he attacked up the draw with 17 men into the rear of a German company position. The German company, caught facing the wrong direction, collapsed. Tomaszewski captured 8 prisoners, killed about 15 Germans, and opened a 300-meter advance for his battalion. When he finally got back to company headquarters that night and reported, his captain, who had been trying to reach him for 5 hours, said, "Frank, who told you to do that?" Tomaszewski said, "Nobody, sir. The lieutenant was dead, and I thought it was the right thing." Francis Tomaszewski received a Silver Star. He went home in 1945. He worked for 37 years at a Miller brewing plant in Milwaukee. He married a woman named Dorothy. They had 4 children. He died in 1998 at the age of 81. He is buried in Wood National Cemetery. On his headstone it says Silver Star, European Theater, 28th Infantry Division. It does not say, because there is no room, that on one November morning in 1944 he did something a German Feldwebel would have been physically unable to do, not because he was less brave, but because his doctrine would not have let him. Let me give you a second example, because this pattern was not a one-off. It was the war. November 14th, 1944. A different sector of the Hurtgen near the village of Wassenach. A reconnaissance squad of the 8th Infantry Division is caught in the open by German artillery. The squad leader, Sergeant Daniel Miller, 24 years old, from Lincoln, Nebraska, has 6 men with him. 3 are wounded, 1 seriously. Miller cannot reach the platoon leader on the radio. He cannot see any other American unit. He can see, across a field, a German battery of 3 75mm guns firing on his position. Miller does something that in the Wehrmacht would have required, at minimum, a captain's permission. He leaves his 3 wounded men in a shell hole with the 2 able-bodied riflemen and takes the 1 remaining man with him, a PFC named Carl Jensen from Iowa, and he crawls, just the 2 of them, with 1 rifle and 1 pistol and 6 grenades, 400 meters through a muddy field while German gunners continued to shell his old position. He reaches a ditch within 30 meters of the German battery. He rises. He throws all 6 grenades in 11 seconds. Jensen stands up and empties his rifle clip into the confused German gunners. Miller empties his pistol. The 3-gun battery goes silent. 11 Germans dead or wounded. The remaining German gunners surrender. 2 of them would later tell interrogators that they had assumed a full American platoon had somehow worked around their position. They could not believe that 2 men had done it, on their own, with no orders from anyone. Miller won a Bronze Star and was promoted to Staff Sergeant a week later. He survived the war. He came home to Lincoln in December of 1945. He went back to work at his father's hardware store. He eventually took over the store in 1961. He ran it until 1985. He died in 2011 at the age of 91. There's a photograph of him, taken in 1983, behind the counter at his hardware store, selling a box of nails to a customer. He is wearing a green apron. He is smiling. Nobody in that photograph would have guessed that 39 years earlier this man had crawled 400 meters through German artillery fire with 1 other boy from Iowa, on nothing but his own judgment, and taken out a gun battery that was tearing his squad apart. That was the sergeant's war. That was what it looked like in practice. Daniel Miller and Anthony Valente and Francis Tomaszewski and thousands more like them, across every American division in Europe, making decisions every day that nobody had told them to make. Part 5. What the Germans said. The German army was a professional army, and like all professional armies, it studied itself obsessively. Its officers wrote after-action reports. Its prisoners were interrogated. Its generals, after the war, wrote memoirs and were interviewed by American and British historians who were trying to understand what had happened. What they said about American tactical flexibility at the small unit level is remarkably consistent across every source. General Major Heinrich Kittel, who commanded the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division in the Hurtgen, wrote in a post-war manuscript that the Americans attacked with what he called a perpetual small unit initiative that made it impossible to construct a defensive front in the conventional sense. His units, he said, could stop a battalion attack. They could not stop 30 squad-level attacks that all happened at once, in slightly different places, driven by sergeants he had never heard of. Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded the Panzer Lehr Division at Normandy, said in his interrogation that the American soldier fights as an individual. He said this with a certain professional wonder. For Bayerlein, this was not how armies were supposed to function, and yet it was working. Another German officer, this one a company commander in the 12th SS Panzer Division, told his interrogators in 1945 that his men had been trained to identify and kill American officers, because they believed that if the officers were eliminated, the American unit would stop fighting. He said, with evident frustration, that this tactic, which had worked against the French in 1940 and against the Soviets in 1941, had completely failed against the Americans. Killing the officer, he told the interrogator, only brought forward the sergeant. Killing the sergeant only brought forward the corporal. They never stopped. They never stopped. Let that sentence sit. Because that's the thing. That's the thing the Wehrmacht kept running into, from Normandy to the Rhine, from the hedgerows to the Hurtgen. Kill the American officer, the sergeant takes over. Kill the sergeant, the corporal takes over. Kill the corporal, the PFC takes over. They never stopped. And the reason they never stopped is that every one of them, from the lieutenant to the private, had been taught that if everyone above him was down, the unit was his. And he had been taught this for months, and he had practiced it in training over and over, until it was not a thing he had to think about. It was something his body did. He did not need permission. He had been given permission once, back in Georgia or in Alabama or in a forest at Fort Benning, by a drill sergeant who had said, "When the moment comes, you move. Do you understand me? you move. And he did. And that was the difference. One more German voice, because this one is important. Oberst Gerhard Triepel, who had commanded an infantry regiment at Aachen and had survived to write post-war, described what it felt like, from inside a defensive position, to be attacked by American infantry. He wrote that the attacks came from too many directions, at too many scales, at too many different times for a conventional defense to answer. He had been trained, he wrote, to defend against a battalion attacking in a coordinated way, or a company attacking on a narrow front. He had not been trained to defend against a forest full of squads, each one acting on its own, each one finding a slightly different seam in his line, each one pushing through whatever weakness it found. By the time his officers had built a coherent picture of the American attack, the picture had already changed, because another 6 squads had pushed through somewhere new. His defensive line, he wrote, did not break. It dissolved. There is a difference. A line that breaks can be rebuilt. A line that dissolves has been eaten piece by piece from 100 directions by 100 small decisions, and by the time you understand what is happening, there is nothing left to rebuild. That was the sergeant's war. That is what Triepel saw. That is what he could not counter. And that is, in the end, what lost the infantry campaign on the Western Front for the Wehrmacht. Part 6. The Final Audit. Let me try to say this plainly, because if you take only one thing away from this video, it should be this one thing. The Germans did not lose the infantry war on the Western Front because they were outnumbered. They were outnumbered at many specific battles. They were not outnumbered, overall, in Western Europe after D-Day. The Germans did not lose the infantry war because they were outweaponed. The MG-42 was better than the 1919. The STG-44 was better than the M1 Garand at short range. The Panzerfaust was a better anti-tank weapon, round for round, than the American bazooka. The Germans did not lose the infantry war because they were less brave. They were not less brave. The German soldier in the Hurtgen was defending his country. He was fighting on the home ground. He had every reason to fight hard, and the casualty figures confirm that he did. The Germans lost the infantry war at the tactical level because they could not generate independent small unit decision-making at a speed the Americans could. American sergeants made decisions faster than German captains. American corporals made decisions faster than German lieutenants. And those decisions, added up across 10,000 small engagements in 3,000 small forests and villages, created a pressure the Germans could not stop, because every time they stopped one American attack, 9 more were already happening somewhere their officers had not yet been notified about. This was not a superiority of technology. It was not a superiority of industry. It was a superiority of trust. The American Army trusted its sergeants. The Wehrmacht did not. And that trust, planted in training fields in Georgia and Texas and North Carolina in 1943 and 1944, grew into a weapon that Germany had no countermeasure for. There is a thing worth saying about trust, because it sounds soft, and it is not. Trust, in a military sense, is not a feeling. It is an investment. When the U.S. Army decided in 1943 that it was going to push decision-making down to the sergeant level, it was accepting a very specific cost. It was accepting that some of those sergeants would make wrong decisions. It was accepting that some of them would attack when they should have held. It was accepting that some of them would get their own men killed by misjudging a situation. And the Army calculated correctly that the gain from having thousands of empowered sergeants making fast correct decisions would outweigh the cost of hundreds of them making fast wrong ones. The Wehrmacht had made the opposite calculation. It had decided, over 200 years, that a perfectly executed plan by a well-trained officer was always better than an improvised plan by a sergeant. because the plan was the product of more intelligence and more information. This was true in theory. In slow, deliberate wars against predictable enemies, on ground that changed slowly, it might even have remained true in 1944. But the war the Americans were fighting was not slow. It was not deliberate. The ground changed every hour. And in that environment, the army that could make 100 fast decisions at the squad level beat the army that could make one perfect decision at the regimental level. Because by the time the perfect decision arrived, the ground had changed and the decision no longer applied. If you have listened this far, hit the subscribe button and stay with the channel. There are more videos coming about the men whose names never appeared in the newsreels, but whose decisions, in forests and villages and crossroads across Europe, won the war at the tactical level. If your father or grandfather was a sergeant or corporal in any of those divisions, drop a comment with his name and unit. These men are mostly gone. Their names belong in the record. Anthony Valente survived the war. He came home to Providence in October of 1945. He opened that garage with his brother Sal, the one he had wanted to open since 1939. It was called Valente Brothers Auto on Federal Hill. He ran it for 43 years. He married a woman named Rose from the same neighborhood. They had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. He rarely talked about the war. When his youngest grandson asked him in 1988 what he had done during the war, Anthony said, "I was a sergeant. I kept my boys alive. That was the job." He died in 2004. Francis Tomaszewski, the staff sergeant from Milwaukee, died in 1998. Daniel Miller, the sergeant from Lincoln, died in 2011. Hauptmann Ernst Bauer, the German officer in the Pine Forest, is buried at Hurtgen War Cemetery, in a section that holds the remains of over 3,000 German soldiers who died in that forest in the autumn of 1944. His family received a letter in 1945. It did not describe the circumstances of his death. It said only that he had fallen for Germany in the line of duty. His son, who was 4 years old when his father died, visited the cemetery for the first time in 1972. He was 31 by then. He laid a flower. He said later, in a memoir, that he had always wondered what his father had thought in the last minutes of his life. He had always wondered whether his father had seen the man who killed him. He never got an answer. He would not have, in any case, understood the answer. His father had died because a man named Anthony Valente, 23 years old, from Providence, Rhode Island, with 3 stripes on his sleeve and no authority to order anything he was about to order, had looked at a map in a rainy forest and decided to act. That is the story you never hear. That is the story the textbooks do not tell, because 3 stripes does not make a general, and a forest does not make a grand battle, and a decision made by a sergeant in 90 seconds does not make a headline. But that is the war that the Americans won. Not in Washington, not in London. Not at the high conferences where the generals argued about strategy. In 10,000 forests and villages where 10,000 sergeants looked at their maps, made their calls, and moved. If you found this video meaningful, subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one, stories of the men whose names are not in the history books, but whose decisions, in small forests and villages and crossroads, decided the war. They are mostly gone now. What remains is the record of what they did, and the men they carried home, and the men they killed, and the families on both sides who never fully understood either. 3 stripes, that was the whole story. A man with 3 stripes on his sleeve, and the permission in his head to act. And the Germans, who had trained for 200 years to build the finest professional army in the world, never built that. And it cost them everything.